Hi everyone, welcome to this special talk that we've planned with Patricia Falcão and Ben Grosser in relation to Ben's solo exhibition at Arbeit Gallery, Software for Less. In this informal sort of conversation today, we're going to be talking about one of Ben's works in particular, Go Rando, which Arbeit actually showed in 2017 in a group show called Blinding Pleasures, curated by Filippo Lorenzen, and has since been rewritten and recontextualized for the current exhibition at Arbeit. Now, just briefly about Patricia. So Patricia is a time-based media conservator working with Ben for her research on her PhD at Goldsmiths. Patricia also works for the Tate, and Ben Grosser creates interactive experiences, machines, and systems that examine the cultural, social, and political effects of software. So yeah, to kick us off, maybe Patricia, you want to just briefly maybe introduce the context that this talk is taking place, and yeah.
The point of my research is to understand other contexts in which artworks are being conserved other than a collecting institution. And so Ben's work, because it was being shown at Arbeit, and it has its own very special context on the net, and within the net, within Facebook itself, it's particularly interesting because of that. And both Arbeit and Ben were super generous to give me your time and allow me to ask questions around the materials of the work, how it might be preserved, how to document it, and how its life might look like in the future, which I think are the key points of this conversation today. So maybe, do we want to start with this? And Ben, do you want to say a little bit about the material of Go Rando and how it works with Facebook?
Sure, yeah. It'll be easy for me to show this at the same time that we talk about it. Actually, all right, let me find where you all went there. Okay. So yeah, Go Rando is it's an artwork that takes the form of a browser extension. It's designed to obfuscate how you feel on Facebook. It grows out of Mark Zuckerberg's Facebook, the corporation's addition to the Facebook interface in 2016 of the reaction. So this is when they added the love, haha, wow, sad, angry buttons alongside the like button. And as is always the case when Facebook starts collecting new data, I'm always curious as to who most benefits from that data collection. And so the work that I built in response to this, thinking a lot about the kind of the emotional surveillance potential of collecting a lot of emotional data on users, was this work called Go Rando. And Go Rando is it's code-based browser extension that goes in a browser such as Chrome, and then it sits between you and the Facebook website when you log into Facebook, and it watches for every time you click on the like button, and then it randomly selects one of the reactions for you. And so you can see it here, if you, when the user clicks like, it says picking, and then it kind of rolls through the choices and selects whatever it selects, love or haha or wow. It might even select like, but you don't know for sure. And the idea is that it will, over time, obfuscate, confuse, inserts noisy data into the system such that Facebook doesn't really know if a reaction is genuine or not. And so as an extension, what that means is simply people are probably most familiar with extensions on their browsers, such as ad blockers would be a good example. Whether it's like AdBlock Plus or uOrigin or whatever it is. A lot of people use ad blockers, and there are other browser extensions that people use for various tasks. It's a way of, it's a designed part of all the web browsers that allows anyone to come along and write code that augments the web browser. And so in this case, what it does is it watches the Facebook interface and listens for clicks in certain places, and then runs code at the appropriate moment to do the actions that I want it to. I could, if it makes sense too, I guess I could talk about a little bit about I think one of the things you and I talked about that we'd thought about talking about today was the kind of the way that doing this kind of work on Facebook is this process of really kind of digging under the hood and looking at not just the front of the Facebook interface, but I'm going to be a little bit bold here and just pull up my Facebook page. We'll see what shows up here. In fact, I guess I should turn off this half-finished version of Facebook Demetricator that I've been writing as part of the show, which is part of what's creating all these weird boxes and things. And part of let me go ahead and see if I can make this work in a way that it will, there we go. And so when I'm writing these projects, I spend most of my time looking at a window that looks kind of like this. So it's got the web browser on the left with Facebook in it, but I'm digging in and looking at code that Facebook delivers to the browser that tells the browser what to do. So let me just go ahead and pull up an example here. So here is that particular like button in the code. You can see when I roll over it. So a lot of what I'm doing is looking at text like this, which just basically looks like noise, and trying to find some kind of a hook to key into so that I can automatically identify certain structures in the code, to find those like buttons, to insert things. In fact, you can see right here is it's an attribute that says Go Rando scene equals true. That's already been inserted by the Go Rando extension that I have installed here right now. So it's already found this and kind of inserted it, and should, you can see it's gonna all freak out doing it with this other window open, but it did work. So a lot of what I end up doing is kind of digging into this and looking through the code and finding ways to do the work that I want to do, finding some way to do something that Facebook really didn't intend for me to do and frankly doesn't want me to be doing. And so certainly makes goes to zero lengths to make it easy, and in fact I think often goes to many lengths to make it more difficult, not specifically for me, but for people like me who are writing browser extensions that manipulate the interface.
I think it's really interesting to see the code in this way, because this is clearly something that anybody could do. They could just pull it up, click inspect, go to elements or whatever it is, and see the code right there. I think what makes this such a craft is that you can spot. You're essentially sort of an investigative person right now, and you're going through the code and really trying to find patterns in this chaos, this noise that you can infiltrate and insert yourself in. I think this is interesting to see it like this.
Yeah, I think first of all, definitely anyone can go and look under the hood in this way. And I encourage people to do so. You're not going to break anything. There's nothing you could damage by I mean, I can go and click something right here and hit delete and it will hide it. It's gone, but you know, you just reload the page and it's back. It's not doing anything on Facebook servers, only kind of like with what's been delivered to you. But it's true, you know, part of, for people like me who've been doing this work for a long time, writing browser extensions on Facebook for a long time, there's been a real change over the years in terms of what it looks like in this box. When I first started doing this with Facebook Demetricator, or even earlier than that, almost 10 years ago, this was a very readable thing. Like you would look in here and all these strings that you see, like G5IA77U1 space MTKW9K, you know, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Oh, this was all readable text, human readable text. There was no weird computer generated codes in here. And Facebook has changed over time in so many ways. One of the ways is that this code is computer generated. They've written the library that then generates this code. It's fairly disconnected from humans. And then they've also intentionally obfuscated this code to make it difficult for people like me to do the work that I'm doing. They don't want there to be anything human readable if they can avoid it.
And so, but if you're looking at it now, what kind of things are you looking for?
So the most useful material for me at this point, when I'm trying to find ways to write code that can automatically detect the right moment in the interface to intervene, play off of these ARIA label, or ARIA. I don't remember exactly what it stands for, but it's accessibility something. It's essentially the attributes that define text that screen readers will speak for people who have screen readers turned on, who say have low vision, for example. And it's almost like a loophole in my view, because somewhere in this code has to be something human readable if a screen reader is going to read it to a human. And so they would love for this to not have to be there, because it's something human readable, but if they're going to make it accessible, then they have to somewhere put something that does this. So I'm often able, and I'm often looking for clues like this. ARIA label equals like, if I were to scroll down, and here's ARIA label equals react. And so this is kind of like the structure that's underneath the reaction menu on that particular like button. And you can click in that and go, and if we really dug in, you could start to see, in fact, well, there's complications, like it doesn't always have everything there for you. It's only until you say roll over that like button. Now that this comes up, and then it kind of starts creating the structure for you, and see there, it's just popped in wherever it is, somewhere down here. I think it's right here. It's the reaction buttons. But so I'm just looking for anything human readable at all first, and if I can find that, I key off of it. But often I end up writing really convoluted looking queries and spending a lot of time looking at text like this and trying to figure out which one of these codes is the most unique to this particular part of the interface, and not just used everywhere throughout, so that it might be useful. The more that I end up having to kind of dig in and key off of codes like this, the more fragile the work becomes, because this stuff is computer generated and it's more likely to change over time, whereas ARIA label equals like is a bit more reliable in its stability.
I think this really brings us on to the second point, which is the maintenance of the work and this constant need to update, not just this work, Ben, but a lot of your other works as well, obviously. I think it would be interesting to hear you speak a little bit about that process. And I mean, I know firsthand that you had a very tumultuous time trying to figure this code out to get Go Rando in the 2021 show or Arbeit. And that's only 4 years. So I'm wondering about your process in terms of maintenance for this work, but for other works as well, you know, how often do you have to update? How often are Facebook, Twitter, TikTok, how often are they updating their code, which means that you then have to update your work?
And also maybe just maybe to add to this is that it feels that, you know, within maybe internet times, the pace is much quicker. But saying that Facebook, the major changes are once every 5 or so years. I don't know, correct me if I'm wrong, kind of, Ben, because you know much better. And I guess the idea is, the question, continuing Rebecca, is to what extent they make their changes that kind of affect your work as a result, and whether, you know, if you think on conservation, what stages of the work, and that's maybe also for Patricia, is what stages of the work needs to be considered as important elements of the development of the work, and where do you say, okay, this tweak here or update here is a bit irrelevant, I'll keep it aside. I think it's just kind of
no, those are both great questions. The truth is 4 years is an eternity. I mean, on a site like Facebook, it's 100% different from where it was, almost 100% different. And in fact, the fact that it isn't 100% different is almost more complicated than it was 4 years ago when I first did this. I mean, the process is essentially some version of, I make a work and I make it work as perfectly as I can for the release of it. And maybe that's the initial release, or maybe that's an update release, or, you know, updating for a new exhibition or some, you know, some event or whatever it is. And from there, all of these works tend to degrade fairly quickly in some way or another. Go Rando's a little bit more specific, and so it might work or not work. A work like Facebook Demetricator, that which is, you know, operating across all different parts of the interface, it can, some bit of it might stop working, and if it's not the most central bit, then as Nimrod was kind of alluding to, maybe I just put it on the list for things to fix the next time I do an update. So I rely on my own use of these works, because I tend to use them myself all the time, to keep track of how well they're working, and if they break, I check on it. I rely on users of the works to report breakages to me, and sometimes they can complain quite loudly, depending on how badly it's broken. You learn how many people rely on something the moment it breaks. That's when you know. The part of the complication with a site like Facebook too, doing this on a site like Facebook, that I think is maybe more unique to Facebook than any other, is that Facebook's development structure, the way that code gets authored, tested, and released into the wild is pretty different from a lot of other big software companies, because they give individual developers the agency to release code into the wild without going through much checks at all. But the way they do that is they release it, it goes through this, like, you could write something and add it, and it gets released to, say, 100 people. And if it doesn't break anything, then it gets released to 1,000. If it doesn't break anything, it gets released to 1,000,000. If, you know, it's like, and it kind of grows out that way. And it allows people to have more agency, but it also means that the Facebook I'm using right now is almost certainly not the Facebook you're using right now in terms of the code. And so when something breaks for me, it doesn't necessarily mean it's broken for everybody else. And that can be dependent on my account, it could be dependent on my location, it could be dependent on my language setting, it could be dependent on, like, which part of the interface I'm looking at and whether or not it got changed for me on that day. And so another strategy I use a lot of times is to wait a day or two. Because I can't tell you how many times I've, like, something's broken, I go and I fix it, I push the update out, and by the time the update actually goes through, like, the Chrome Web Store and gets through all the verification processes, Facebook has switched back to the code they had 2 days ago because they figured out something's broken, and I made a fix based on that. So I've also learned to just wait a day or two and see if it works magically again. And sometimes it's also about hope. Going back a little bit to Rebecca's question too, on the original question on the kind of the cycle from 2017 to 2021. This was a lot easier in 2017 to do. And part of it stemmed from the fact that when they added those reaction buttons, and when you went and right-clicked on the like button, you could go see, even though you didn't see them pop up until you hovered over the like button, those buttons were all sitting there waiting for you. They were already in the code. And that made it easy for me to find them and kind of like watch for any rollover and then just instantly do things. And what became complicated and why I had gone through multiples, they made a big change, I don't remember what it was, 2019 or something. And it broke everything. And I spent a ton of time trying to fix Go Rando, and I worked on it for a while and kind of made progress, and it didn't work. Put it aside. I then hired a student who had more experience in kind of the library that's used to generate this code to see if she might be able to help me, and she wasn't able to really get any further. Then I hired a former student who's now out in California who had gone through, who worked in the industry to help me, and she couldn't figure it out. And so I kind of had given up on ever making this work. Because even there was a problem back then of the accessibility things I key off of. There was a big bug that Facebook had in the accessibility part of the reactions interface. It just didn't work under certain conditions. And I had been in contact with their accessibility team trying to get them to fix the bug. I didn't tell them why I wanted them to fix the bug, but and they said they would, but they never did until this big redesign came out in 2020, and they finally, they rewrote it. But yeah, I don't know what it is. I mean, Rebecca and you and I have talked about, of course, kind of we had several conversations of could this be revived? And I don't remember how I appeared at the time, but I was kind of like, yeah, I mean, I'll give it one more try, I don't know. And I don't really even know what it was that allowed me to finally find some workaround to the complication of the fact that structure now, that thing where I said all that code is kind of sitting there waiting for you, all the wow, haha, sad, angry buttons. Now they aren't there until after you roll over the button, then it dynamically inserts them into the code and rearranges everything so that they're there. And that just makes it a lot more difficult for me to work with because I have to write a lot more logic to kind of watch for certain conditions and key off of things. And anyway, so I don't know if that answers all those questions, but it at least gives a sense, hopefully.
Can I continue that line of thought and ask something about, because you said that users report to you, and there are other kind of plugging artists. I'm sorry that I'm putting you in a very specific type of thing, and there are a few that were kind of recently. Well, again, the definition of art within that, it's quite broad, I would say. But is there like a joint effort of everyone that's using your plugins and your work, and other people that develop this that might use yours or you use them? Is that like a joint effort? Maybe it's an unwritten thing that we all work together in order to make all these plugins that focus either on Facebook or Twitter, that they kind of hack the systems? Or is it something that you decide to do on your own, and sometimes someone will give you an advice or you'll send an email or whatever?
So when I first started, people were pretty much on board to help. And there are enough people who use some of the things that I make who may say have some programming background, for example. And so, when I first started doing this work, they would offer. That's one of the reasons I started putting things up on GitHub. It's, people could see the code, they could submit an issue, they could propose a fix, and they could write the fix, and I could just, accept the fix. And so some of that happened in the early years, but part of what's changed over time is that the complexity of doing this work has gone up tenfold over 10 years. And there are not a lot of people who want to sit and look at that window I showed you all of just nothing but machine generated codes and trying to find ways to navigate that procedurally. It's tedious. And so what you end up with, and this is where like the difference between art and business or art and utility, and kind of the way I think some of these works straddle that, which is if say, for example, one's goal was to just hide metrics on Facebook, a lot of people would say, well, we'll just hide, say, the whole line where all the metrics are. And that's easier to find than to say, find where it is, where it says 3 comments, then detect that it says 3 comments, and then to like generate the structure so that it leaves the word comments, but also hides the 3 comments so that Facebook can keep updating that metric while you've got them hidden in case you toggle off the metrics, the hiding, so that it shows you an updated value. So it's kind of like how much attention to detail of kind of the aesthetic presentation of the thing that the work is doing. In Go Rando, you know, it would be easier if I didn't do that kind of animation and rolling through things and do the picking, and if it just was like, you click like, it just instantly clicks, just enacts one of the reactions for you, it would be functionally the same, and it would be visually quite different. And those differences, I think, are some of the things where someone else coming along might be like, well, the fix is to just do it this way. And I'm the picky person who's like, well, yeah, but that's not actually what to me, that's throwing out half the work.
But also in terms of kind of, I guess is it a group of developers, a group of artists, a group of people that puts, you know, as a goal, let's infiltrate those systems and put our art or our applications or within them in order to do something, and then would they, I guess, would you speak to them? Would you talk to them? Are you part of a group, or is that you're single? And also, I guess, because there's so many kind of punishments from Facebook, for example, for developers that develop this, or is it something that you're kind of hiding, you know, in the shadows, not trying not to? Well, I guess through this show and the amount of press and in general the amount of press that you have around your work, you cannot really hide, and it's something that you don't want to hide. But whether at some points you feel that you're like, you know, a hidden group of artists that try to make these things.
Yeah, I mean, I haven't been in much conversation over the years with the people doing this. I mean, there haven't been that many people who've come along and dug deep into the Facebook interface to do this kind of work. The closest analogs are those who build more kind of intentional utilities for, say, user well-being, allowing you to dramatically tweak the interface. And I mean, what would be ideal from my perspective would be if we were to have some kind of a collectively written layer between Facebook and the extensions. Something that was kind of like a collectively managed way of adapting to how it changes on Facebook, but that keeps a continuously, a consistent interface for extension writers. So I could say, find all the like buttons, and whatever the command is we all decided was the command to find all like buttons. For me, it's the same command forever, but then when we write the layer that sits between what I do and Facebook, as Facebook changes, we change that part. So it's like, so not every extension has to get rewritten, but only one thing that sits between all the extensions and Facebook gets rewritten. This is kind of the theory behind a library called jQuery, which is very common in the world of web programming, and it's becoming less needed, but it was a library that allowed people to do manipulations of web pages as part of their coding in the age when browsers were really variant in how they worked. And it was a way of having kind of a consistent language and library we could learn as just regular people. And then people who are really into it and really into like making these things work, they would do all of the work behind the scenes to make sure it worked on every single browser in the same, you know, in this, even though all those browsers are different, it appeared the same to people like me. That's kind of what would be great, but certainly the other thing you mentioned of the way that Facebook is increasingly going after people, and this has actually been true for many years. It's hard for me to even necessarily predict exactly what triggers Facebook to go hard against someone or to go less hard against someone. But it certainly seems like the more users you have is, unsurprisingly, is something Facebook seems to key off of, or metrics. But also the kind of the visibility and this thing of how much manipulation do they see it as manipulating data, as automating things? So there's been a lot of press around the unfollow everyone extension. I may not be exactly right on the name of that, but this actually happened in the summer, but it's been getting a lot of press in the last week or two, which is the developer it's like unfollow everyone, which was just basically like you could install it and it would go to your friends page, and instead of you clicking unfollow on every friend you have, it would just do it for you, so you didn't have to do it 1,000 times. As a way of letting someone kind of have a new, like just get rid of the news feed essentially, and just have the rest of Facebook available to them. And Facebook, it's a good example of how Facebook has really amped up its attacks. If anyone's interested, I suggest you go look up the cease and desist letter that this person got, which was hardcore, included everything from not only do you have to stop making this and take it down, but you have to give us like every account and password you've ever had on any Facebook system. You have to give us every document and every piece of code you've ever written that ever has done anything on Facebook for your entire life. You have to do, I mean, it was so egregious. And I don't think anybody would actually it's not designed to produce all that material. It's designed to scare someone so much that they'll stop, even though there's not really any great legal basis to make them stop. There's basis to kick them off the platform as a user, but
yeah. Okay. Yeah, Sorry.
I'm just coming back to the documentation of the work and what this means in terms of conservation. Patricia, I don't know if you wanted to maybe speak a little bit about any other areas that you may have been looking at. I mean, I know that we've mentioned GitHub, but you know, like archiving a work like Go Rando isn't really just about the code, it's about the look of it, it's about how it appears on different Facebook profiles throughout the years. I mean, Ben, you've said that Facebook is, 4 years in Facebook language is an eternity.
Yeah.
So yeah, maybe Patricia, you want to kind of bring in a bit of the research into this and maybe what you're working on or what you found.
So I think there's two very interesting sides of this. And one, I'm biased towards the code, I must say, on one hand, just because it is the least visible and the one that is harder to understand if you don't have access to Ben and to that aspect of the code. So, and I feel that because Ben puts it on GitHub and it's available there, it's almost a form of documentation as well. You know, it provides access. And then the other point that you're making, Rebecca, that this other side, which is the experience that the users have when they use it online, and as Ben also said, that there are different versions of Facebook online at any point in time and for different users is another aspect. And how you keep track of that, assuming that at some point the code won't be working, and that you might not be able to make it work on Facebook for whichever reason is. So how do you then represent this work if you can't use Facebook anymore? And I think that's maybe more of a question: is it more about this concept, and then you just tell the story of the concept? Do you want some visual prompts to that, and how might that look like?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, I think there's with a project like Go Rando, there's what the work does, and that it does it is, for many people, as much of the work as they need. The concept that someone would write a code that would randomize the way they appear emotionally to their friends is radical enough and kind of triggering enough for people to think, well, why would you do that? What sense does that make? Isn't that going to confuse everybody? What does that mean? So, I mean, there's some aspect of it that doesn't necessarily require someone to do it themselves. I certainly would argue and hope that someone who, does try it themselves has a deeper experience of what it is to not just know about the idea and kind of like think about emotional surveillance and think about data obfuscation as kind of a reaction to emotional surveillance and big platform kind of mechanisms of data extraction. But it's in this case, it's so much about that moment when you click the like button and Go Rando rolls through it and it picks something for you, and then when it lands, now you're forced to have to think about, are you willing to let yourself be represented by that emotion in that moment with that piece of content? And at the very least, what it does is it kind of forces this brief consideration of what it means to be accurate or not on these systems, of whether just because a platform asks you to report your emotional reaction accurately, if you are obligated to do so. And if you do choose to go with an inaccurate emotion, then what does that mean for your relationships on the site? And how does that mean you might be seen in the future? And are you going to have to clean this up down the road? It's just like, there's like all these things that really get at the fact that we are on, in this case, an interface that is asking us to report how we feel all day long about everything we see. And many of us feel obligated to do so. So for me, those are all parts of the work too.
Yeah, we had a group of students in last week, and one of the students was asking, what happens if, for example, for want of a better example, Donald Trump in 2017 used Go Rando, or anybody in fact used Go Rando, and it made a really, really problematic judgment about a statement. Would that come back to bite them? And I think, at the time I said, that's a really good question, I'll put it to Ben, but I think this is exactly what you're saying, is that it kind of forces us to understand that Facebook isn't really just this like cutesy social media platform. Like, it has consequences. What you do on there has consequences, and quite serious consequences if you use it in the wrong way, and if you affiliate yourself with perhaps the wrong groups and this kind of thing. So I think what Go Rando does for a lot of people, maybe, or for me now, is like thinking about accountability for actions and how much we want to give to a platform like Facebook.
Yeah, certainly, even as the writer of Go Rando, as the maker of Go Rando, as someone who's used the Go Rando logo as my avatar since 2017 on social media platforms, on Facebook in particular, even in 2017, a lot of people, people knew I was doing this project. They would still, I was just using Go Rando all the time, and so I was just feeding all these bogus reactions to the system. I would get these comments from people like, why are you angry about this? I don't understand? And, or why are you sad about this good thing that happened to me? And so sometimes it's just confusing, you know, to users, like what's going on? Why do you feel that way? But sometimes it could be really inflammatory. I mean, someone could write something really sensitive about a very critical moment in their life, for example. Death in the family, injury, sickness, just as an example, and you could click like and it says, haha. I mean, that creates this intense moment of friction between like how someone would see you, and you have to think through that. What does it mean to really stick with this? And of course you can undo it and pick one if you can change it if you want to. You don't have to live with it just because it picked that. But it's that moment of really forcing things into the foreground, and I think it also brings up a lot of things about just the stakes are different for different people, and the interface tries to pretend like everybody's treated the same and everybody looks the same and it's one big happy community, as Mark would say. But the truth is, if I'm an American with a U.S. passport and I'm white and I click like and it selects angry on something that is, I don't know, anti-government. That's one kind of reaction that gets recorded in the database about me. But if I'm a person of color with a Middle Eastern passport and I'm on Facebook and I click angry on the same anti-US thing, like the consequences could be really different because this data is getting drawn on for all kinds of things. Social media data is getting used for all kinds of things, not just to target ads, but to characterize individuals and their personalities, and for all kinds of intelligence purposes. So it kind of puts that into the foreground too, that like we're not all treated equally in these platforms.
I guess also because of what happened recently with Facebook and WhatsApp kind of going down, and you know, kind of it puts the onus on, well, it really shines a light on the fact that so many people use these platforms not just to connect with people. They use it for the news, they use it for surveillance, they use it for all different kinds of things. And I think, yeah, that's also why Go Rando is quite an interesting and still quite a very relevant work, is because it's almost not about the user anymore. Go Rando, it's about really trying to get away from showing yourself online and giving away your valuable data, even if it is a kind of like a farce of what you feel. I think, you know, this idea that Facebook is now it's almost like a surveillance state in itself is quite scary. And I think I don't know if people are really aware of that, to be honest, like the general public.
I mean, I think they're becoming more so in the last few months than they have maybe in the previous few years, or certainly the last 4 years have been a tumultuous time, 4 or 5 years since the Trump election, the Brexit vote, and Cambridge Analytica, and you know, a lot of these things have brought things more to the foreground. But I think there's a tendency for a lot of people to go, well, that's kind of like some big question that's for governments, and that's not really about me and just me and my friends on Facebook, which I'm not really part of all that stuff. You know, it's easy for people to feel like they're in some bubble when really they're subject to the same mechanisms that we all are. Yeah.
So do you think, or how would you talk about Go Rando in the absence of Facebook? I think even if the platform eventually ends at some point, and it's still it's going to be a massive cultural reference for probably hundreds of years or so, and not wanting to predict the future, but can you see how that might be represented in this absence?
Yeah, I mean, certainly I feel like, here, I'll share my screen briefly again, because I think it'll help me illustrate a little bit. So, you know, this is the current version that we looked at a minute ago that works with the current version of Facebook. But I try to hang on to, you know, the original documentation too. So this is the original 2017 version, back what Facebook looked like back then, and how the interface, you can see how different it is. I mean, in general, it's the same, but things look different. They're in different places. They work somewhat differently. And so one answer to your question is is that I definitely am always trying to hang on to the screenshots and movies and screen recordings and you know, I make GIFs a lot of kind of like how these projects work, and I make videos about them too. So there's a kind of a promo video that I launched with Go Rando in 2017 that's part of the exhibition at Art Byte now and for Go Rando. There's the different material that has been created for these exhibitions, such as what I call the Go Rando noise image, which is kind of this massive array of all the different reaction icons, kind of massively overlaid and semi-transparent on top of each other. That's currently a big banner in the show, and there's been previous versions that have been projections and fabric banners and images. They've been used for media articles and things like that. And so there's, you know, Go Rando's had a pretty rich life across, you know, it's been in BBC kind of, you know, like shows about how to navigate the online world with, you know, in creative, strange ways. It's been, you know, in the Atlantic writing about like, you should be thinking about what the Facebook algorithm is and what it does, a kind of more kind of public interest. It's written about in books and other kind of academic articles and popular kind of media, more kind of, you know, mainstream publications. So from my perspective, like a presentation of the work is in the future, in some, you know, unknown future, when either Facebook doesn't exist, which is a great thing to think about, or even just when Facebook is so different that Go Rando isn't really a thing anymore. Would be to contextualize it with a lot of that material. You know, someone being a curator to decide what, you know, what tells the right story, like what tells a good story from all of the potential material. But certainly I think there's a lot of options of things to pick from.
If I may add something as well on that, because that I think since the launch of Go Rando, doing kind of as part of Planning Pleasures and, well, general, that exhibition that Filippo curated, and today the kind of 4 or 5 years that have passed, we have really grew as an organization, as a gallery. Back then it was in Hackney Wick, and now we're in kind of City Island, which is much larger and more kind of bigger and more ambitious space. But I really enjoy seeing how there's still the same thread and same interest, and things are still continuing in our thinking about what is that we do. And I guess Go Rando as a plugin was the first kind of plugin that was, I guess, launched or that we worked with, and that really opened up the route for a few other works that we've done using plugin. In general, the thinking about curating and what it means to work within the context of a web browser, as a, I guess, as an application, and the variety of things that can be done. And I think there's something really incredible about the process that this work has been kind of revived for this show. It was still there, but I guess this new life within the context of your exhibition here. I think it's a really important piece that it was great to have again. And I guess also through this conversation between yourself, Patricia, and me and Rebecca, when we could have joined, it opened up a lot of new ways of thinking of what is basically our role as a gallery, as the institution that deals with digital media. And I think this specific piece is a great example of us doing what we need to do, and is to think about the past, the beginning of it, the current place for it, and then how it would continue and evolve in the future. So thank you, Ben, for doing it and then redoing it again. Probably you've been redoing it quite a few times in between, and for Patricia to kind of spark that conversation and to really engage with us on what it means. So yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I would just add briefly to that from my perspective, the idea that a gallery is going to have a role in kind of keeping a net artwork going for years, or helping a net artwork to have some life over a span of years, is a really unusual thing to encounter. You know, a lot of net art is very brief because of the context it lives within, and the net is very changing all the time. And so, I mean, I've said it, I know, privately, but I definitely have also credited, I happily credit Rebecca publicly for having enthusiasm for, you know, like, well, couldn't you just try one more time, kind of a, like maybe there's some other way, or couldn't we get you some help in this way or that way, right? And that, you know, like, that's just not a thing that I think people trying to manipulate Facebook in these strange, weird ways encounters out in the world much of the time. So I'm super appreciative of it. And I also have appreciated talking with Patricia along these lines too, because I feel like someday I hope that a work like this might be of interest to a big institution, right? That, I mean, whether it's this one or some other work that has nothing to do with me, that big institutions would be interested in having a role in kind of the long-term preservation, view, exhibition of these kinds of artworks that have these strange, weird, short lives, and maybe can be maintained and maybe not. And you know, eventually to do that kind of work really needs to be handed off to a big institution that will have massive public resources to handle that over lifetimes. But I feel like part of what I see Arbeit's role here too is kind of like serving as that transition. It's like, it's the difference between things just stopping working in 2 weeks or 2 months or whatever, and they're just the codes on GitHub, but nobody ever made them work again. to maybe someday institutions want to collect it, but there's been no work in between those 2 points to keep things going, to recontextualize them as things change in the world. We certainly couldn't have anticipated all the Facebook news in the last 2 weeks happening in the last 2 weeks, right in the middle of this show. So anyway, so I appreciate all of the 3 of you in this call, and the role and work you've played over the last year around this work.
Thanks, Ben. Patricia, do you have any closing remarks, or we've kind of gone over everything that you wanted to?
No, I think we've mentioned all the key points that came out from the interviews as well. So I just want to say that also having a small gallery like Arbeit engage with a conservator is not something that is that common. And having the luxury of spending hours talking to all 3 of you is it's already been one of the highlights of this research. So thank you, all of you.
You're welcome. I mean, I think as Nimrod said, like it's about a new responsibility for galleries who want to work with artwork of this nature. I think there has to be a responsibility there, even for galleries like Arbeit, who we don't represent artists and we don't really collect work like that, like a bigger institution would. So I think it shows a need for this change of of workload, of labour, of responsibility, and of future proofing of work like this, for sure. Thanks for joining us, Ben and Patricia.
Yeah,